Hello everyone, I'm Eric Rain and today I want to show you one of the coolest Warlock builds I've ever made. This build deals absolutely insane psychic damage. In fact, it can deal so much damage that you can literally one-shot most bosses in the game. On top of that, it's versatile, easy to play and honestly just a lot of fun. Personally, I think this is one of the strongest Warlock builds in the game, if not the strongest. Let me show you why. The core idea behind this build is combining Shadow Blade with the Resonance Stone. For those of you who don't know, the Resonance Stone is a unique item that makes all nearby creatures vulnerable to psychic damage. Meanwhile, Shadow Blade is a magical weapon that deals exactly that type of damage. Together, especially when combined with Killer Sweetheart, these two can easily one-shot almost any boss in the game. But the best part is that you still get to use all the other cool Warlock tools, like Eldritch Blast, so you're not limited to melee attacks. That's what makes the build so strong. It has ridiculous burst damage, but it's still flexible. So yeah, here's the idea of the build, now let's break it down. We'll start with leveling, but as always, you'll find all the timestamps in the description below. So before we begin, I should mention that this is a mono-class build, meaning we're not going to multi-class at all. You could multi-class if you wanted to, but in my opinion, it would only make the build weaker. So at level 1 we pick Warlock. For cantrips we absolutely want Booming Blade and Eldritch Blast. These will be our primary cantrips throughout the game. If you're starting the build from level 1, you'll mostly be relying on Eldritch Blast early on, whereas Booming Blade becomes much stronger later in the game. By the end game, however, you'll be using both. The subclass doesn't matter too much, though I personally think Hexblade fits the build best. For spells we pick Armor of Agathis and Hex. Armor of Agathis greatly improves our survivability in both the early and late game. As for Hex, I mainly recommend using it with Eldritch Blast. It can also be useful with regular weapon attacks, although we'll be relying on it less once we reach Act 3. Our starting ability scores should be 8 Strength, 16 Dexterity, 14 Constitution, 8 Intelligence, 10 Wisdom, and 17 Charisma. At level 2, I recommend taking Arms of Hadar, since it can be useful throughout Act 1. For your Eldritch invocations, take Agonizing Blast and Repelling Blast. As I mentioned earlier, Eldritch Blast will be our primary source of damage during the early game. Agonizing Blast significantly increases its damage, while Repelling Blast is a toggleable passive that allows your blast to push enemies. At level 3, I recommend picking Mirror Image, and you should also choose Pact of the Blade. This allows you to bend your weapon, making it scale with your charisma instead of strength or dexterity. More importantly, you absolutely need this pact because otherwise you won't gain extra attack later on. At level 4, you can pick Blade Ward for additional survivability. This is also the point where we finally pick the Shadow Blade, the spell I mentioned earlier. Shadow Blade summons a magical weapon that deals psychic damage. On top of that, attacks made with this weapon have advantage if the target is standing in dim light or darkness, which is incredibly useful. The blade disappears after every long rest, so don't forget to summon it again whenever you wake up. Level 4 also gives us our first feat, and here obviously we take ability improvement to raise our charisma to 19. Later in Act 1 you can get another +1 charisma from Auntie Ethel's hair, bringing you up to 20 charisma. That might not sound like a huge increase, but because of Agonizing Blast, our Eldritch Blast scales extremely well with charisma. Because of that, we always want our charisma to be as high as possible. At level 5, we gain the Deepened Pact feature, which gives us extra attack on our pact weapon. For spells, I recommend taking Elemental Weapon. As you may have noticed, we're picking up quite a few buffs on this build. The reason for that is simple. Warlocks don't have many spell slots, but they recharge after every short rest. This means we can buff ourselves before combat, take a short rest, and then start the fight with all of our buffs active while still having our spell slots available. Making full use of this mechanic is extremely important if you want to get the most out of the build. For Eldritch invocations, I highly recommend taking Armor of Shadows. This allows us to cast Mage Armor for free, which is incredibly important since since we're not going to be wearing armor on this build, at least not in the late game. During Act 1, it's perfectly fine to use light armor instead of a robe. At level 6, you can pick Grand Flight. At level 7, we gain access to a very important spell, Staggering Smite. It's basically a version of Divine Smite that deals psychic damage instead of radiant damage. The best part is that damage from Staggering Smite stacks with the damage from your weapon, allowing you to deal absurd amount of psychic damage with a single attack. We'll talk more about that in the gameplay section. For your next Eldritch Invocation, I recommend taking Devil's Sight. Not only does it allow us to see through regular darkness, but it also lets you see through magical darkness. This means you can use spells like Darkness to make yourself extremely difficult for enemies to hit. I talked about this trick in my previous Paladin build, but on this build it also works extremely well. By the way, at level 8 you should also pick Darkness. For your feat, I highly recommend picking Savage Attacker, since it significantly increases our average damage output. At level 9 we take Greater Invisibility. As for your Eldritch Invocation, the choice doesn't matter too much. Personally, I ended up taking Minions of Chaos. At level 10 I recommend picking Phantasmal Killer, since it also deals psychic damage and can be useful in certain situations. At level 11 we gain access to Mystic Arcanum, which allows us to cast one of these level 6 spells for free once per long rest. Personally, I don't find most of them particularly useful on this build, but you can take Create Undead if you'd like an additional frontline unit that can soak up some hits for you. As for your regular spells, it doesn't really matter what you pick at this point. At level 12, your spell choices are once again largely up to personal preference. However, it is very important that you take Life Drinker as your final Eldritch Invocation, since it raises our weapon damage by adding necrotic damage equal to our charisma modifier. As for the feat, it's actually a pretty tough choice. On one hand, you could increase your dexterity to gain more armor class and better initiative. On the other hand, this build relies heavily on concentration spells, meaning Warcaster can be incredibly valuable. It gives us advantage on saving throws made to maintain concentration, which is something we'll be doing constantly. Personally, I would pick Warcaster, unless you already have another source of advantage on constitution saving throws. And of course, if you're playing with a full party instead of solo, you'll generally have to make fewer concentration checks anyway. But yeah, that's how I recommend leveling the character. Now let's move on to gear. One of the most important items for this build is Potent Robe. Not only does it significantly increase the damage of Eldritch Blast, but it also works with the Booming Blade, meaning it can boost the damage for our melee attacks as well. If you're playing a Warlock, this item is pretty much mandatory. You can obtain it by rescuing the Tieflings from Moonrise Towers, and then speaking with Alfira at the Last Light Inn. As you can see, this item also scales with Charisma, which is another reason why we want our Charisma score to be as high as possible. That's also why I recommend getting Birthright as soon as you reach Act 3. The hat can increase our Charisma up to 22, and can be purchased from Sorcerer's Sundries. The best part is that it stacks with the Mirror of Loss, meaning you can reach up to 24 Charisma. And for that, you don't even need Auntie Ethel's hair, since it's possible to gain +3 Charisma from the Mirror of Loss alone. If you don't know how to do that, you can check out my video on permanent bonuses. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, you also need the Resonance Stone to make enemies vulnerable to psychic damage. You can find it in the Mind Flayer colony in the Act 2. The nice thing about this item is that you don't need to equip it. Simply keeping it in your inventory is enough, and its area of effect is surprisingly large. For this build, I also highly recommend getting Killer's Sweetheart. This ring allows us to guarantee a critical hit after killing an enemy once per long rest. And honestly, that's all we need. One guaranteed critical hit is usually enough to kill most bosses in the game with this build. Unlike the Paladin build I covered previously, we're not trying to crit as often as possible. Instead, we're trying to make a single critical hit deal an absurd amount of damage. You can find Killer's Sweetheart in the Shar's Gauntlet during Act 2. I also recommend using the Strange Conduit Ring, since it further increases our psychic damage while we're concentrating on a spell. You can find this ring in the Githyanki Crash, specifically inside the Inquisitor's Chamber. As for gloves, the best option is obviously the Spell Might gloves. These gloves gives us access to a toggleable passive that reduces our chance to hit in exchange for increased cantrip damage. The best part is that the gloves work not only with Eldritch Blast, but also with the Booming Blade, and for whatever reason, Booming Blade doesn't suffer from the attack roll penalty. So when using melee attacks, these gloves effectively give us free damage with no real downside. You can obtain the spell Might Gloves from Lucretius after completing the Clown quest in Rivington. When it comes to the offhand slot, there are two possible setups, and the one you choose depends on your playthrough. If you're not playing solo, you can equip a second Shadow Blade in your offhand. To do that, you'll need to hire a hireling, cast Shadow Blade, dismiss the hireling, and then hire them again. The summoned weapon will remain, allowing you to transfer it to your main character, and now you can put it in your offhand. This setup technically gives us higher damage output, but after a lot of testing, I came to the conclusion that it's usually not worth it, and there are several reasons for that. The first issue is that the offhand Shadow Blade always uses its base damage, even if the spell was upcast by the hireling. The second issue is that because we can only bind one weapon through Pact of the Blade, the offhand weapon won't scale with charisma. Instead, it will rely on dexterity for attack rolls, causing us to miss much more often. The last issue is that the build isn't exactly tanky. We only have 14 constitution, and even with all of our gear and defensive buffs, our armor class isn't particularly impressive. That's why I generally prefer using a shield instead of a second Shadow Blade. In my opinion, the best choice is the Adamantine Shield, since it prevents enemies from landing critical hits against us, though Viconia's Walking Fortress is also an excellent option. If you don't have either of those, any shield that provides +3 armor class will work perfectly fine. Now, if you're playing with a full party, then sure, go ahead and use the second Shadow Blade. At that point, survivability is not that important. As for a solo honor mode run, I think it's unnecessarily risky. As you may have noticed, I always test my builds as a solo honor mode build without external buffs like Aid or Hero's Feast. That's where a build's weakness really start to show. A full party playthrough is much more forgiving when it comes to mistakes and inefficient builds. Sorry about the rant, but it genuinely annoys me when people call their build the best without actually putting it through serious testing. When I call a build one of the best, I genuinely mean that. But anyway, let's get back to the gear. For our ranged weapon, I recommend either the Darkfire Shortbow or Gaunter Mail, since both give us access to haste. Sure, you could use scrolls instead, but personally I find that pretty tedious. As for the remaining equipment slots, there are plenty of good options. Personally, I went with the Cloak of Displacement, Evasive Shoes, and the Amulet of the Harpers. With these items, I'm mainly trying to improve the build's survivability as much as possible. With that being said, there are plenty of viable alternatives. These are simply the items I ended up choosing. Now let's move on to gameplay so you can see how this build actually works in practice. As you might have guessed, preparation is incredibly important for this build. As I mentioned earlier, Warlocks can restore their spell slots with short rests, which means we want to apply as many long-lasting buffs as possible before combat and then immediately recover our resources. After every long rest, you would need to spawn a new Shadow Blade, and don't forget to bind the weapon so it scales with charisma and grants access to your bonus attack through Pact of the Blade. You should also cast Mage Armor through Armor of Shadows for additional armor class. On top of that, I recommend using upcasted Armor of Agathis, which gives us a substantial amount of temporary hit points. At the same time, you can cast Elemental Weapon, since we're going to recover our spell slots immediately afterwards anyway. You can also summon an Elemental and a Mummy if you'd like. Personally, I didn't bother with them while recording this video because I wanted to keep things simple, but that doesn't mean they're useless. For your Elixir, I highly recommend using the Elixir of Bloodlust. The Elixir grants us an additional action whenever we kill an enemy. Since this build is exceptionally good at deleting targets, we'll be triggering that effect constantly. All of the buffs I listed can be applied immediately after a long rest, because they last until the next one. Just remember to take a short rest after. Before difficult fights, however, we can take things even further. This is when I recommend applying buffs such as Mirror Image, Haste, Blade Ward, Grant Flight, Blur, and anything else you think you'll need for the encounter. Once again, apply your buffs, take a short rest, and then start the fight. Just remember that you can only maintain one concentration spell at a time, so make sure you know what your game plan is before combat begins. For example, example, it's a terrible idea to cast haste and then immediately try to use staggering smite. If you do that, you'll lose haste and just skip your turn. During combat, you can also make excellent use of darkness, as I mentioned during the leveling section. Just keep in mind that it's also a concentration spell. Another incredibly useful spell on this build is greater invisibility. With this thing, you can easily escape fights that start going badly. Or if you prefer, you can simply one-shot the boss and disappear immediately after that. Some people might call that cheesy, but honestly, I think it's completely fair. After all, you killed the boss fair and square. By the way, if you want to one-shot most bosses in the game, all you really need is a guaranteed critical hit combined with staggering smite. It's also worth mentioning that you can get another guaranteed critical hit through the illithid power Luck of the Far Realms. It only requires 2 tadpoles to unlock, and it's absolutely worth picking up. Against regular enemies, however, I usually don't bother with this combo because it's a complete overkill. Most of the time, a regular booming blade is already enough to kill them. One important thing to remember is that some enemies are completely immune to psychic damage. The most notable example would be the Steel Watchers in Act 3. Fortunately, this isn't a huge problem. At the end of the day, you're still playing a Warlock with an incredibly powerful Eldritch Blast. With the spell Might Gloves and Hex, it's not difficult to deal around 100 damage with a single action. By the way, if you pick the Hexblade subclass, you can also make use of Hexblade's Curse. Not only does it increase the damage you deal to cursed targets, but it also restores some of your health when the target dies. As you know, with Hexblade, the curse can sometimes be applied automatically when attacking with a bound weapon. Of course, you can also apply it manually whenever you want. When it comes to the other subclass features, Armor of Hexes didn't do much during my testing. I wouldn't call it useless, but I definitely wouldn't call it game-changing either. A Cursed Spectre, on the other hand, is a passive feature that summons a friendly spectre whenever we kill a cursed enemy. It's a nice bonus, and I do like the fact that you can have multiple specters active during a single fight. With that being said, I got pretty frustrated when I realized they're immobile by default. This means that if they get blinded, they'll often just stand there doing absolutely nothing for the rest of the fight. They're still nice to have, but I definitely wouldn't rely on them too much. When it comes to other spells that we picked, you can still use them, but I would call them pretty niche. But I think that's all for today. Remember to subscribe if you don't want to miss future Baldur's Gate 3 videos. Also, let me know in the comments if you like this build or not. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.